When we think of retirement planning today, we imagine compound interest, diversified portfolios, and the slow, steady accumulation of wealth. We view pension funds as safety nets, boring, predictable, and designed to support us in our twilight years. But there is a darker lineage to the modern pension, a financial instrument from the 17th century that turned longevity into a blood sport. Imagine a system where your financial security wasn't based on how much you saved, but on how quickly your neighbors died. This wasn't a fringe gambling den. This was state-sponsored finance adopted by the most powerful empires on Earth. It was called the Tontine. In this system, you pooled your money with thousands of others, but as the investors died off one by one, their dividends didn't go to their families. They were redistributed to the survivors. The last person standing took everything. It was a retirement plan that directly incentivized murder, fraud, and a macabre obsession with the mortality of strangers. For over 2 centuries, the Tontine fueled wars, built American landmarks, and drained national treasuries, all while turning innocent investors into grim reapers waiting for a pulse to stop. It was the ultimate intersection of blood and money. Today we are going to open the ledger on the Tontine curse, analyzing the mathematical flaws, the economic desperation of kings, and the chilling reality of a financial product where the only way to maximize your ROI was to be the last survivor breathing. To understand the Tontine, we must first analyze the economic catastrophe that birthed it. The year was 1653, and the Kingdom of France was bleeding capital. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was merely a teenager, and the country was effectively being run by his prime minister, Cardinal Mazarin. France was embroiled in the ending phases of the 30 Years' War and the internal civil conflicts known as the Fronde. The royal treasury was not just empty. It was running on a deficit that threatened the stability of the entire monarchy. The traditional methods of raising capital, increasing taxes on an already starving peasantry, or selling public offices, had been exhausted. The crown needed a massive injection of liquid cash, and they needed it immediately. Enter Lorenzo Tonti. Tonti was a Neapolitan banker, a man who possessed a dangerous combination of charisma and mathematical creativity. He approached Cardinal Mazarin not with a loan, but with a proposal for a new kind of life insurance, though the term insurance is misleading in this context. Tonti proposed a state-sponsored loan that would never have to be repaid. This was a revolutionary concept for a government drowning in debt. In traditional state loans, the government had to pay back the principal with interest. Tonti's scheme, however, turned the capital into a sunk cost for the investor, exchanging the principal for a lifelong annuity. The genius of Tonti's pitch lay in its appeal to human greed and the gambler's fallacy. He suggested that the state creates a fund where investors buy shares. These investors would be divided into classes based on their age. The state would pay an annual interest on the total capital raised, say, 10%. This interest would be distributed among the surviving members of the pool. As members died, their share of the interest would not revert to the state, nor would it go to their heirs. Instead, it would be redistributed among the survivors in that class. Tonti argued that this mechanism solved the crown's problem. They received immediate cash and only had to pay the interest, which would naturally cease when the last investor died. For the investor, the allure was the prospect of immortality and infinite wealth. If you lived long enough, you could theoretically receive an annual income thousands of times greater than your initial investment. It was a bet against death, pitched to a desperate cardinal by a banker who understood that men would always wager on their own survival. However, despite the mathematical intrigue, the French Parliament initially rejected the proposal, viewing it as too speculative. It would take decades and even more desperation for the seed of the Tontine to truly germinate, but the blueprint for financialized mortality had been drawn. While Lorenzo Tonti died in obscurity, ironically, in the Bastille, his idea survived him. By 1689, Louis XIV was desperate again, this time to fund the War of the League of Augsburg. The Tontine was finally implemented, and to understand why it became such a phenomenon, we must break down the financial mechanics that made it so seductive to the 17th century investor. This was not simple interest. This was a weaponized annuity. The structure was deceptively simple, yet mathematically predatory. Investors would purchase a share, often for 300 livres. They were then separated into 14 distinct classes based on age, ranging from children to the elderly. The interest rate offered by the crown corresponded to the age group. Higher initial rates for the elderly, as they were statistically expected to die sooner, and lower rates for children. For example, a child might start with a 5% return, while a 70-year-old might start with 10% or higher. The crucial economic lever was the survivorship clause. Let us analyze a hypothetical scenario to see the compounding power of death. Imagine a class of 1,000 investors who each put in £100. Fast forward another 10 years. If only 10 people survive, they each receive £1,000 a year, a 1,000% annual return. They are now wealthy beyond measure solely because their peers have died. The last survivor clause meant that the final person breathing would technically be entitled to the entire interest pool of the original group, though later regulations often put a cap on this to prevent the crown from funding a single millionaire. This structure fundamentally altered the psychology of finance. In a standard bond market, you want the economy to thrive so the issuer can pay you back. In a tontine, you are economically incentivized to desire the death of your co-investors. Every obituary column became a financial report. Every plague, every bad winter, and every war was a potential windfall for the survivors. It transformed the passive act of aging into an active competitive sport. The mechanics relied on the crown's assumption that people would die quickly enough to reduce the state's burden, and the investors' assumption that they would outlive everyone else. As we will see, both sides miscalculated the variables, leading to a financial disaster that would haunt the global economy for centuries. When Louis XIV finally authorized the first state tontine in 1689, the crown viewed it as easy money. The objective was to raise 1.4 million livres. The logic of the French finance ministers was rooted in the rough mortality tables of the time. They assumed that war, disease, and poor health care would rapidly thin the herd of investors, eventually extinguishing the debt obligation completely when the last person died. They viewed the tontine as a loan that would naturally liquidate itself. However, the crown made a critical error in their data analysis. They underestimated the selection bias of the investors. The people who bought into tontines were not the average, sickly peasantry who dragged down the national life expectancy statistics. The investors were the wealthy bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, people with access to better food, warmer housing, and superior medical care. Furthermore, shrewd investors didn't just buy shares for themselves, they gamed the system. A savvy merchant would not buy a share on his own life. He would buy a share on the life of a healthy, robust teenage girl who had already survived smallpox. The nominee system allowed capital to be placed on the heads of those statistically most likely to survive the longest. This was arbitrage of human longevity. The crown expected the investors to die off according to the general population's mortality rate, but the tontine pools were filled with genetic outliers and the pampered elite. The result of the 1689 tontine was a financial hemorrhage for the French state. Instead of the debt vanishing quickly, the investors, or their chosen nominees, refused to die. As the decades rolled on, the payments to the survivors ballooned astronomically. By the time the last survivor of the 1689 tontine finally died, a woman named Charlotte who passed away in 1726 at the age of 96, she was drawing an annual income of 73,500 livres on an original investment of 300 livres. From a return on investment (ROI) perspective, this was a staggering success for the investor, representing a return of over 24,000%. But for the state, it was a disaster. The king had borrowed money thinking he could pay it off with the deaths of his subjects, only to find himself paying exorbitant sums to ancient widows for 40 years. This miscalculation highlights a fundamental principle in economic history. When financial products are designed based on poor data, the entity taking the risk, in this case, the crown, will inevitably be exploited by the market participants who understand the variables better. The 1689 tontine proved that the mechanism worked, but it also proved that the cost of blood money was far higher than the French monarchy had ever anticipated. The financial virus of the tontine did not stay contained within the borders of France. Across the Channel, England was watching. In the late 17th century, England was undergoing its own financial revolution, desperate to modernize its economy to fund King William III's 9 Years' War. Ironically, a war against Louis XIV, the very monarch who had popularized the tontine. The English government, observing the massive influx of capital into the French treasury, decided that if they could not beat the French strategy on the battlefield, they would match it in the bond market. In 1693, the English Parliament passed the Million Act. This legislation was a watershed moment in British financial history. It authorized the raising of £1 million, a staggering sum at the time, partly through a Tontine scheme. The offer was structured similarly to the French model. Investors paid £100 for a share, and the total pool would yield a 10% annual payout until the year 1700, after which the survivorship clause would kick in. As participants died, their dividends would be reallocated to the living, creating that same morbid incentive structure that had captivated Paris. However, the British implementation revealed a fascinating divergence in national financial temperaments. While the French embraced the gambling aspect of the tontine with fervor, the English were initially more skeptical. The subscription for the 1693 tontine actually underperformed. The English public, more accustomed to the stability of land ownership and terrified of the government defaulting, was hesitant to sink capital into a dead wager. They preferred the alternative option offered in the same act, a flat 14% annuity for life without the survivorship benefit. This hesitation forced the British government to analyze the data. They realized that the tontine, while potentially lucrative for the winner, was administratively chaotic. Tracking the deaths of thousands of nominees scattered across the countryside required a bureaucracy that barely existed. Furthermore, the volatility of the payouts made long-term fiscal planning impossible for the Treasury. How do you budget for national expenses when your debt service payments depend on whether or not a smallpox epidemic hits a specific demographic of investors? Despite the initial tepid response, the 1693 tontine established a dangerous precedent in London. It legitimized the idea of securitizing life expectancy. It turned the concept of death duties on its head. Instead of paying the state when you died, the state paid you because others died. This period marked the transition of the tontine from a desperate royal decree to a formalized, regulated financial instrument. It was no longer just a king's whim. It was an act of parliament. This legitimacy paved the way for private tontines to flourish, moving the scheme out of the halls of government and into the coffee houses of London, where the stakes and the risks would become personal. As the 18th century dawned, the tontine evolved from a government funding tool into a target for sophisticated financial engineering. The greatest flaw in the tontine design was the nominee system. The state assumed that investors would pick random nominees, themselves, their wives, or their children. They assumed a natural distribution of mortality. But bankers in Geneva, Switzerland, saw a mathematical loophole that would bring the French treasury to its knees. They realized that if they could identify a specific demographic with the highest statistical probability of survival, they could create a superclass of investors that would never die. This led to the creation of the 30 Jeanvin maidens, Les Demoiselles de Genève. A syndicate of Swiss bankers scrutinized mortality tables, primitive as they were, and identified that young girls, aged 4 to 14, from wealthy, rural families had the highest life expectancy in Europe. They survived childhood diseases better than boys, they didn't go to war, and they didn't die in childbirth, yet. The bankers then scoured Geneva to find 30 young girls who fit this perfect profile. The syndicate then purchased massive blocks of French tontine shares, naming these 30 girls as the nominees for every single share. They didn't just buy one share per girl. They pooled capital from across Europe to buy thousands of shares riding on the pulses of these specific children. This was the first instance of a derivative backed by a basket of human lives. The bankers treated these girls like precious assets. They monitored their health, ensured they had the best doctors, and shielded them from risk. The result was a catastrophe for the French crown. The actuarial tables used by the government predicted that a certain percentage of the nominee pool would be dead within 20 years. But the Jeanvin maidens simply refused to die. Decades passed, and the syndicate continued to collect 100% of the dividends, distributing the profits to their wealthy clients while the French treasury bled. The Immortal 30 became legendary in financial circles. One specific case highlights the absurdity. A Jeanvin banker collected dividends on a share linked to a woman who lived to be 98. By the time of her death, the return on the original capital was astronomical. This Jeanvin arbitrage proved that the Tontine was fundamentally broken as a state instrument. It wasn't a game of chance. It was a game of information asymmetry. The bankers understood the biology of survival better than the politicians understood the math of debt. This exploitation was so severe that it eventually contributed to the fiscal crisis that triggered the French Revolution. The Tontine had been designed to save the king. Instead, it helped bankrupt him. While Tontines were destroying public finances in Europe, they were crossing the Atlantic to build the infrastructure of the New World. In the American colonies, and later the United States, the Tontine took on a different, more tangible form. Capital was scarce in the young nation. There were few banks, and the stock market was in its infancy. When communities needed to fund large public works or private buildings, they didn't issue municipal bonds. They launched a Tontine. The most famous example of this is the Tontine Coffee House in New York City. Established in 1793 at the corner of Wall Street and Water Street, this was not merely a cafe. It was the epicenter of American finance. A group of merchants wanted to construct a building that would serve as a merchant's exchange, a place to trade stocks, shipping news, and commodities. To raise the $32,000 required for construction, a massive sum in 1793, they sold 203 shares at $200 each. The structure was a classic Tontine. Each share was tied to a nominee. The dividends generated by the coffee house's profits, rent from offices, fees from traders, were distributed among the shareholders. As the nominees died, the remaining shareholders split the pot. The final 7 survivors would inherit the entire property fee simple. This arrangement turned the building itself into a death clock. The Tontine Coffee House became the de facto headquarters of the New York Stock Exchange before the NYSE had a permanent home. The Buttonwood Agreement, which founded the NYSE, was signed just outside its doors, and the business moved inside shortly after. For decades, the Tontine Coffee House was the beating heart of American capitalism. But in the background, the blood money clock was ticking. As the 19th century progressed, the number of survivors dwindled. The ownership of this prime Wall Street real estate concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. It created a perverse incentive where the surviving owners had no reason to maintain the building or invest in upgrades because they were old and just wanted to maximize immediate cash extraction before they died. Why repair the roof if you might be dead next year? This depreciation problem became a hallmark of physical asset tontines. By 1870, the Tontine Coffee House experiment ended, but it had proven that tontines could build cities. From hotels in Boston to bridges in England, the Tontine was the crowdfunding platform of the 18th and 19th centuries. However, as the stakes got higher and the survivor pools got smaller, the stories of fraud began to surface. It wasn't just about waiting for people to die anymore. In the lawless expansion of the West, some investors began to wonder if they could speed up the process. The transition from passive investment to active elimination was about to begin. As the 19th century matured, the Tontine transitioned from a tool of state finance to a playground for the morally bankrupt. We must analyze the specific fraud vectors that this financial instrument invited. In modern insurance fraud, the most common crime is faking a death to collect a lump sum payout. The Tontine, however, inverted this dynamic entirely. In a Tontine, the money stops when the nominee dies. Therefore, the financial incentive was to fake life, to keep a nominee alive, on paper long after they had been buried in the ground. This created a macabre market for resurrectionists, but not the kind who stole bodies from medical schools. These were fraudsters who stole identities. In rural France and England, there were documented cases where an investor would hold a share on the life of an elderly villager. When that villager died, the investor would simply conceal the death. They would bribe the local priest to delay recording the burial in the parish register, or worse. They would find a body double, another elderly person of similar build and appearance, to present to the verification agents during their annual check-ins. The verification process was the weak link in the chain. In an era before photography, fingerprinting, or centralized databases, proving someone was still alive was shockingly easy. A signed affidavit from a local magistrate, often easily bribed, was usually sufficient to release the annual dividend funds. This led to zombie shares, where dividends were paid out for years on the heads of corpses. The actuarial tables were being corrupted by data that claimed people were living to 110 or 120 years old, while in reality, the capital was being siphoned off by fraudsters. But the fraud wasn't just passive. The last survivor, Tontines, which promised a massive jackpot to the final living member, introduced a far darker incentive: active elimination. While mass murder was rare due to the difficulty of killing hundreds of strangers without detection, targeted elimination in smaller private tontines became a genuine concern. If a local tontine had only 3 survivors left, and the pot was worth the equivalent of $5 million today, the accidental death of a rival was not just a tragedy, it was a business strategy. This moral hazard fundamentally broke the trust required for a functional financial system. A stock market relies on transparency. A tontine relies on opacity. You didn't want your rivals to know you were sick, lest they celebrate or accelerate your demise. Conversely, you wanted to know everything about their health. This paranoia stifled the liquidity of the shares. You couldn't easily sell a tontine share because the buyer would demand an invasive medical inspection of the nominee. The asset was toxic, illiquid, and inextricably linked to the darkest impulses of human nature. By the mid-19th century, the tontine had acquired a stench that no amount of profit could perfume. The cultural penetration of the tontine was so deep that it became a central plot device in Victorian literature, most notably in Robert Louis Stevenson's 1889 black comedy, The Wrong Box. To understand the public sentiment toward this financial instrument, we must look at how it was satirized. Stevenson, usually known for high adventure or gothic horror, chose the tontine to explore the banality of evil. The novel's premise is an actuarial absurdity, a massive tontine established for children, where the final pot has grown to a staggering sum, and only 2 elderly brothers, Masterman and Joseph Finsbury, remain as the survivors. The brilliance of Stevenson's critique lies in the behavior of the younger generation. The brothers themselves are old and relatively passive, but their nephews and cousins are circling like vultures. The plot descends into farce when one of the brothers is presumed dead in a railway accident, and his frantic family attempts to ship his body home in a barrel to conceal the death, not out of grief, but to keep the tontine claim active. The body is misplaced, misidentified, and shuffled around England in the titular Wrong Box. While the book is a comedy, the financial subtext is scathing. Stevenson was illustrating the agency problem inherent in tontines. The actual beneficiaries, the elderly survivors, often had little control over the capital. The real stakeholders were the younger, debt-ridden relatives waiting for the payout. The tontine commodified the elderly, turning grandfathers into walking lottery tickets. Their health was monitored not out of love, but out of anxiety for the quarterly dividend check. This literary exposure reflected a shifting public mood. The Victorian era was obsessed with propriety, thrift, and moral rectitude. The tontine, with its gambling mechanics and death betting, began to look increasingly uncivilized compared to the rising industry of legitimate life insurance. Life insurance was marketed as an act of altruism, protecting your widow and orphans after you were gone. Tontines were framed as acts of selfishness, gambling on your ability to outlive your friends to secure a luxurious old age. The Wrong Box marked the beginning of the end for the tontine's social acceptability in Britain. It highlighted that a financial product enticing you to hide a corpse in a piano case was perhaps not a sound pillar for a modern economy. However, just as the tontine was fading in England, it was about to mutate into a corporate monster in the United States, shedding its amateur comedic roots for a ruthless, institutionalized efficiency that would dominate Wall Street for 40 years. In the post-Civil War United States, a new breed of financial titan emerged, and the most pivotal figure in the history of the tontine was Henry Baldwin Hyde. Hyde founded the Equitable Life Assurance Society in 1859, and he realized that standard life insurance was a hard sell. It forced men to confront their own mortality and offered them no personal benefit, only a payout to their heirs. Hyde needed a product that appealed to the American spirit of speculation and the desire to get rich during one's lifetime. He dusted off the concept of the tontine, but re-engineered it for the corporate age. Hyde introduced the Tontine policy, later known as deferred dividend insurance. This was a hybrid monster. It looked like life insurance, but it acted like a tontine. Here was the pitch. You buy a policy and agree to a tontine period, usually 20 years. If you die during this period, your family gets the face value of the policy, but no dividends. If you lapse on your payments, stop paying premiums, during these 20 years, you lose everything, your coverage and all the premiums you paid. However, if you survive the 20 years and keep paying your premiums, you hit the jackpot. The accumulated dividends from everyone who died, and crucially, the forfeited cash values of everyone who lapsed, were pooled together and paid out to the survivors. Hyde correctly calculated that in the volatile American economy, millions of people would lose their jobs or run out of cash and be forced to lapse on their policies. He wasn't betting on death, he was betting on financial failure. This was known as the lapse factor. Hyde's actuaries knew that nearly 60% of policyholders would drop out before the 20 years were up. The Equitable effectively cannibalized the equity of the struggling middle class to pay massive bonuses to the wealthy survivors who could afford to keep paying. It was a transfer of wealth from the weak to the strong, packaged as insurance. The product was an explosion. By 1905, nearly two-thirds of all life insurance in the United States was Tontine-based. The big three insurers, Equitable, Mutual Life, and New York Life, controlled assets that rivaled the U.S. Treasury, almost entirely fueled by Tontine premiums. They built skyscrapers, bought senators, and controlled the capitalization of American railroads. The Tontine had ceased to be a quirky gamble. It was now the engine of American capitalism. But by tying the nation's savings to a scheme that relied on a 60% failure rate, Hyde had built a house of cards that was destined to attract the scrutiny of the law. The inevitable crash wouldn't be caused by a lack of survivors, but by the sheer, unbridled corruption of the men managing the pool. By the dawn of the 20th century, the American Tontine system had become a financial behemoth too large to ignore. The insurance companies, led by Equitable, were no longer just insurers. They were essentially unregulated investment banks. They were sitting on surplus, funds worth hundreds of millions of dollars, money that belonged to the policyholders but wasn't scheduled to be paid out for decades. This created a massive slush fund for the executives. In 1905, the powder keg finally ignited. Internal power struggles at Equitable leaked to the press, revealing that executives were using Tontine surpluses to fund personal lifestyles, influence political elections, and manipulate the stock market. The public outcry was so intense that the New York State Legislature launched the Armstrong investigation. Led by Charles Evans Hughes, a future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the investigation was a surgical strike into the heart of corporate greed. Hughes meticulously dismantled the Tontine model, exposing how the big three-foot insurers had systematically misled the public about expected returns while using the money for extravagant and corrupt purposes. The investigation revealed that the Tontine was not just a game of survival for the policyholders. It was a rigged game for the corporations. The insurers had complete discretion over how the surplus was calculated. They frequently lowered the dividends paid to survivors while increasing their own salaries and commissions. The investigation proved that the deferred dividend system allowed for total opacity, enabling embezzlement on a scale never before seen in American finance. The Tontine wasn't just a curse for those who died early. It was a theft from those who lived. The Armstrong investigation's findings were so damning that they led to the rapid-fire passing of the New York Insurance Law of 1906. This was the death knell for the Tontine in America. The law mandated that life insurance dividends must be distributed annually, rather than being deferred for 20-year Tontine periods. It effectively outlawed the survivorship mechanism that had made the Tontine so profitable for the lucky few and the insurance companies. By requiring annual distributions, the law removed the lapse factor that Henry Baldwin Hyde had so ruthlessly exploited. No longer could a company seize the equity of a struggling worker and give it to a millionaire. The ban on Tontines fundamentally reshaped the American middle class. It forced the insurance industry to become what it is today, a risk management service rather than a high-stakes gambling den. However, the ban was a double-edged sword. While it ended the systemic corruption and the deadly incentive to outlive neighbors, it also removed one of the only high-yield investment vehicles available to the average person. The Tontine had been a crude but effective way to ensure a massive payout in old age. Without it, the burden of retirement planning shifted towards safer, lower-yield bonds and savings accounts. The curse was gone, but so was the lottery-style dream of a golden retirement. For over a century, the Tontine remained a ghost of financial history, confined to textbooks and old novels. But as we move deeper into the 21st century, the tontine is attempting a comeback. Economists and actuaries are beginning to argue that our current pension systems are failing. With people living longer than ever and social safety nets straining under the weight of aging populations, some financial innovators are proposing modern tontines or tontine-like annuities. The modern argument is analytical and data-driven. If we remove the winner-take-all, jackpot, and the incentive for murder, can the mathematical core of the tontine be used for good? A modern tontine would be a low-cost retirement pool where participants receive higher payouts as members of the pool die off, essentially providing longevity insurance. It solves the problem of outliving your money by ensuring that as long as you are alive, your income grows. But the stigma of the 17th century curse remains. Regulatory bodies are hesitant to reintroduce a product that essentially commodifies death. The ghost of Lorenzo Tonti still haunts the ledger. We must ask, is the tontine a naturally flawed concept that brings out the worst in human greed, or was it simply a brilliant mathematical idea that was weaponized by the corrupt monarchs and corporate raiders of the past? As we face a global retirement crisis, the answer to that question might determine whether the tontine remains a historical curiosity or becomes the future of our financial survival. To understand why the tontine persisted for centuries despite its obvious moral failings, we must look at the psychological profile of the investor. Behavioral economics suggests that humans are notoriously bad at assessing their own mortality. We suffer from overconfidence bias, leading almost every investor in a tontine to believe they will be the one to survive the longest. This irrational optimism is what allowed the scheme to flourish in every era from the Sun King to Wall Street. The tontine also tapped into a dark form of gamification. It turned the slow, agonizing process of aging into a competitive pursuit. Instead of dreading the loss of peers, the tontine investor found a silver lining in every funeral. This psychological decoupling, viewing the death of a neighbor as a financial gain, is the true curse. It erodes the social fabric, replacing community support with a calculated wait for the inevitable. The tontine's legacy isn't limited to the West. In Japan, the Tanamashiko functioned as a communal lending circle that shared tontine-like characteristics, helping build rural economies through mutual survival. In the American South, certain fraternal organizations used tontine structures to fund the construction of halls and hospitals, proving that when the blood money was redirected toward community goals, it could actually serve a positive purpose. These variants show that the structure of the tontine is a neutral tool. It is a mathematical engine for pooling risk and reward based on time. The deadly reputation comes not from the math, but from the lack of transparency and the concentration of the jackpot. When the tontine is used for small-scale community building, it thrives. When it is used for state-level warfare or corporate embezzlement, it becomes a weapon. As we close the files on the tontine, we are left with a chilling realization. The modern financial world is built on the bones of these early experiments. Every time you check your 401k or receive a pension check, you are participating in a system that evolved from Lorenzo Tonti's deadly retirement plan. We have sanitized the language. We talk about mortality credits and actuarial adjustments instead of the last survivor's jackpot. But the underlying logic remains. The tontine curse teaches us that in finance, there is no such thing as a risk-free return. If a product promises wealth without work, the cost is usually hidden in the life or death of someone else. The tontine turned longevity into a liability for the state and a commodity for the investor. As we navigate the complex economy of the future, we must remember the lesson of the 17th century. When you make a bet against death, the house always wins. And the house is usually the one that drafted the rules while you were too busy counting your neighbor's gray hairs.